Welcome to Cow Talks. I'm Chris Pravat, Beef Cattle and Forage Commodity Director for the Alabama Farmers Federation.
And I am Marcelo, Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida.
And this is our podcast, where we dive deep into the main topics affecting livestock and forage production in the southeastern United States.
From the mainstream media to new technologies straight from our research stations.
From cattle prices to international trade.
From our pastures and beyond.
Join us on this journey as we tackle the main issues affecting our producers and the sustainability of our production systems.
Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. This is Marcelo Wallau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida. Today, we're continuing our series on integrated crop livestock systems in a project partially sponsored by the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Office of Agricultural Water Policy. In this project, our goal is to understand the opportunities and challenges of integrating cattle and cropping systems, and to devise strategies to help our stakeholders to implement more sustainable agricultural practices. Our guest today is Dr. Kim Mullenix. Dr. Mullenix is the chair of the Department of Animal Sciences with Auburn University, and previously she had been the beef cattle extension specialist at Auburn University with Alabama Cooperative Extension. Dr. Mullenix has a great experience in forage and livestock production systems in the Southeast, and she is a recurring guest in our podcast. Back in 2023, Chris and I interviewed her about preconditioning calves, which ties very well with the conversation we're going to have today. If you have not heard that podcast yet, take a look in the 2023 archives of the Cow Talks podcast. Kim, welcome back.
Hey, Marcelo, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to visit with you a little bit.
Kim, not too long ago, we had our first Southeastern Integrated Crop Livestock System Symposium in Marianna, and we had an excellent audience and an excellent program. You spoke there, and I want to follow up on some of the conversations we had and pick your brain a little bit more about how we can make this happen, how we can integrate cattle into cropping systems. First of all, from a cattle perspective, what are the opportunities of bringing the cattle into the cropping system?
That's a great question. So I think really there's a lot of opportunities for cattle producers when we think about the integrated crop livestock system. So one, if we just think about cattle production goals in the Southeast in general, a goal that we have is to extend grazing on almost an annual basis. And so when we look at our forage production systems, we have both warm season forages as well as cool season forages that allow us to do that. Integrated crop livestock systems give us a window to be able to go in and plant those cool season annual forages and to utilize that for grazing during a time of the year when maybe we're feeding hay and supplemental feed otherwise. But also the thing that really stands out to me in that is that that is also the best quality of forage that we can grow during the entire calendar year. So certainly there's some opportunities there from a cattle management standpoint and cattle production view, but also there's some other benefits to think about too when we integrate into this system. What about the nutrient return that we get from the livestock that are going into that crop production system? What about the forage diversity of that system? And then obviously the benefits of having that cover for the subsequent row crop season later on. So there's kind of the traditional view of if we only look at it through the cattle lens, but also if we look at it from a bigger picture perspective, it really helps tie together some things from an environmental management standpoint and conservation management standpoint as well.
So in our previous episode, we talked to Dr. Audrey Gamble, your colleague there in Auburn, and she emphasizes a lot the importance of that nutrient cycling with the cattle. And one thing that is very interesting to me is that people think that if you put cattle to graze the cover crop, you are eliminating the cover crop, you are removing nutrients. But actually, through proper grazing management, we can increase the biomass production and improve that nutrient cycling. Dubé has some fantastic work that he has done showing that whatever the microbiota in the soil can do in terms of decomposing that organic matter of the cover crop residue throughout the season, the cattle can do that in pretty much a couple of days, and that's nutrient available for the plants.
Right. And well, I appreciate what you said too about grazing management, that is such an important piece of that, where we're managing that biomass that's out there in a way where we do have some residue that's carry over into that subsequent row crop season, but also capitalizing on the nutrients returned by those animals. So having that balance is something that is unique about this system.
So, from your experience, what type of animals are we looking for here? I know we can raise anything, but what is the most return on investment that you have seen?
Right. So most of the work that we have done with integrated crop livestock systems and in just interactions with our producers is looking at a stocker cattle model for this system. So typically where in the fall of the year we would purchase those lightweight calves, we may background them for a period of time before the cool season forages are available. So let's say we purchase those animals in September, October timeframe, background them for a period of 45 to 60 days, and then target that December, January timeframe to start grazing in the cover crop system. And the reason that that system has such great application is because, again, the focus of a stocker cattle system is to be able to take those lightweight calves, grow them out to a target weight, and increase the uniformity of those calves for marketing at a later time. So when we put them on cool season forages, they really just start to blossom and grow once they've been through that backgrounding period and then transition to that high quality forage.
So, for the beef cattle producers, what's the advantage of having those animals backgrounded in uniform in terms of selling them?
Right. Well, so I'll kind of break that into two parts. One is what is the advantage of having them backgrounded? So, one, from a health management perspective for those calves, we have to think about in the Southeast, we're primarily a cow calf system. And then those calves ultimately go on to the Midwestern or Western US for finishing in a feed yard. But that kind of middle time frame for that stocker system is very important to get those cattle healthy, to build their immune status, and to help prepare them for that subsequent feed yard phase. So this system allows us to do that because it gives us a bit more time to retain those cattle here in the Southeast, helps them build immunity in their system, and they're older by the time they go to the feed yard. So there's some advantages from that perspective. And then if we look at once they've been through that grazing management system in the ICLS, what we see is that they typically have very good average daily gain and gain per acre in that production system. And we hit a target of generally somewhere between 750, maybe up to even 900 pounds for those cattle that they're being grouped together and marketed for the feed yard. So the uniformity in that management of them through the cool season system is important because when they then go to the feed yard, those buyers understand how those cattle were managed, that they were managed on grass, and they understand how to transition those cattle then into the feed yard based on their knowledge of how they were previously managed here in the Southeast.
Nice. So pretty much we can have the return on investment on the gain. So we're adding gain to them. And also there is a bonus on the price because of that preconditioning, that backgrounding, getting those animals, well, healthy animals, vaccinations and all that. We talked more about that in the previous preconditioning episode if you want more information. But
Right.
there is a bonus price for that. So keeping on talking about stockers, and we're thinking always Chris is a big proponent of a truckload, and many farmers do not have the capacity, both the financial capacity, operational capacity, or the resource capacity to have a truckload. So that means we cannot do anything if integrated systems if it's not large scale.
I would say that's not true. So, we can think about kind of that smaller operation. And if we look at the average cow herd size across our states, in Alabama, it's roughly about 30 cows on an operation. Well, what can we do with those 30 calves? So I believe we can still add value to those calves through practices like preconditioning, whether it's through a feeding scenario or through this grazing scenario that we're talking about in this system. And even if we don't have that truckload lot unit, having that relationship with your stockyard or with whoever purchases your calves can help provide maybe some of that incentive or possible greater value that could be received for those calves. So communicating that early in the process to whoever is going to buy those cattle, letting them know that I have this group, it's a small group, but this is how they've been managed. This is kind of the extra things that I've done from them other than just selling them at weaning. That's a way to maybe get some additional value too. And we've seen that with some of the producers that we work with.
One of the things that popped up so frequently there at the symposium was about building this trust, building those relationships. A lot of the farmers were talking about the relationship between the beef cattle rancher and the row crop farmer. Also, we were here exploring the relationship between the farmers in the market, so developing that relationship with the stockyard that can help you market those animals better, add value in that. Another thing that came up, Kim, that was very interesting from the perspective of one of our producers is, so if you retain those animals, so let's say we have those calves, now we decided, okay, instead of selling the calves, we're going to take them to the starter phase. We're going to take them forward because we have this resource now, which is the cool season forages. Well, if we're retaining them, why don't retain them a little further and put a little more weight towards the summer?
Right. That's a question that we receive sometimes is looking at, once they've been on cool season forages, should we then transition them to summer forages after that to possibly get some additional weight gain on those animals? So one of the interesting things that I thought came out of the meeting was one of the producers was talking about that and just the relationships that he has built with feed yards over the years and some of that feedback that he had received from marketing of his calves. And he said specifically that they really want them to come off of those cool season forages and then directly go in that transition into the feed yard. And I think one reason I interpreted that they might want that is from a nutritional standpoint of, if we shift from that high quality cool season forage and then move to a summer forage, even though at that time of the year the summer forage is really at its highest quality, there's still that transition that the cattle have to acclimate their rumen to. And so we don't want to see that and have a potential maybe even loss in weight or just loss in time of gain by making that transition. So in some respects, maybe it's easier that when they come off the cool season forage, they go on directly to a feed yard and they only have to be transitioned that one time.
That one time, yeah. One of the important things about this whole system is also that we time things proper, and we can only do that if we have a proper reproduction season too, because we want those calves to be at a ideal weight at the end of that season to be able to ship them out west to get the most value. That goes back to the topic of old and still current topic of breeding season.
Absolutely.
Getting that breeding season short, not having bulls year round, but making strategic decisions on when we're going to calve, when are we going to wean, and what we're going to do with those animals.
Right. Uniformity is our friend. That's what I would say.
Uniformity is our friend. A lot of, even though people think I don't want uniformity because I want cash flow year round, but the cost of having that cash flow without uniformity is just tremendous. We're better off saving money in a savings account if that's the case. Anyhow, that's a different conversation. But going back to the repro management, many of our folks, many of our farmers are going to tell me, I don't want to deal with stalkers. I want to sell those calves and be done with them. This system is not for me. And I said, okay, that means you don't have replacement heifers.
That's a good point.
What is the opportunity for replacement heifers in those systems?
Sure, right. I think there is a great opportunity for replacement heifers and looking at their development as part of this system. So we had a demonstration project at one of our research centers in North Alabama that explored this topic, looking at replacement heifer development and then target breeding of those replacement heifers in the May-June timeframe of year. So we would receive heifers from producers around the holidays and then put them on hay and supplement until the forage was available for grazing in the cool season system, and then kept them on those high quality cool season forages until that May-June timeframe when they reached their target breeding weight. So what we saw is that, they also performed very well on those high quality forages. They had very consistent gain once they transitioned onto those cool season forages, and it allowed us to develop those animals to that target weight for breeding, which is really that goal that we have in that system. So even though it's a replacement heifer, it is kind of like that stocker model in some sense too, that it's a growing animal. We're utilizing high quality forage to support her growth, but her goal and her target is just a little bit different than what we see in that stocker system.
Yeah, and if we're thinking about a spring calving season, by the time we're removing those animals from the cool season forages, that's our breeding time, and that's when they're going to be on their prime. So it really makes sense
Right,
from the replacement heifer perspective.
right.
We here discuss very broad perspectives on the opportunities. We discuss some of the challenges in a broad perspective. I want to go down to the ground a little bit more and take the next step. I mean, for people that are really serious about this, they really want to implement. It's not something for taking for granted. I'm just going to go to the market. I'm planting some ryegrass. I'm going to go to the market and get some animals, and or finding some land that has been planted in cover crop, and we're going to go graze. Things are not simple. There is a lot of planning. Can we talk a little bit about those challenges, the practical challenges in management strategies for really implementing those systems?
Right. Well, I think one thing to consider is that relationship piece that you mentioned early on is if we're going to go down the road of looking at grazing and cover crop systems, if we're talking about two separate entities, that it's a row crop farmer and a cattle producer that are working together to figure this out, really, I feel like that's probably a year-long process to identify a farmer that could be a cooperator with the beef cattle producer, and then working through some of those management considerations about what infrastructure would be needed for grazing if it does not already exist, and then answering some of those questions about how do we pay for things. So the planting of the forage, fertilization, fence, watering systems, those are first considerations that I would think about. The second piece is that we know a lot of our producers in this region, if they have row crops, they also have cattle. So, but thinking about how we can be maybe more intentional with that grazing management and those systems is something that I see is how can we have that more uniform calf crop that could then go on those systems and graze it in the winter months. So those are two kind of pieces that I see.
So I'm going to take apart a few of the things here so we can discuss a little further. The relationship part is very important. Sometimes we don't have the relationship because the same farmer, row crop farmer, has cattle and is putting the animals there. One of the things that I see a lot is that people think about cover crop as a low input activity. They're just, I like to say, there's a difference between planting and throwing seeds in the ground. A lot of people just go there and throw whatever, buy the cheapest seed, throw them in the ground, and they call it a cover crop. Now, if we're going to graze and take the most out of the systems, we need a totally different approach. First, choosing the right forages, right forage species, and then second, be intentional, as you mentioned, about fertilization. I know you had some positive and some also challenging experiences with some of the species choice that you had in your systems, right?
That's right. I think about cover crops and diversity of forages in those systems as an important piece, particularly for a cattle producer. I think that's also an area of emphasis we see more so now in just cover crop systems research is understanding that when we have those diverse species that there are some advantages to the system from having those in there. But selecting the right mixture of forages to be able to get some growth distribution during the grazing season is important. So most producers, I think if you ask them about this system and grazing window, they would say, I need at least 60 days. I would really like to have as many as I can, but I absolutely have to have at least 60. Some people would say, Kim, I need way more than 60. 60 is
Yeah.
not my minimum. So that piece is an important consideration in that relationship. But from the forage diversity standpoint, if we look at common species that are used in these mixtures, one of them is typically going to be a small grain. We have legumes and even things like brassicas that may come into those blends. The small grain piece is important because it can provide that early window of grazing. What we see is that a lot of times in these cover crop systems, cereal rye has traditionally been used as one to go in that system. And it can be so early that maybe we can't even capitalize on the grazing of that forage before it's hit maturity. So maybe coming back and looking at some other small grain species, so things like oats, things like wheat in the system, how they fit in, along with those other species like the legumes and brassicas.
Yeah, we have experience here with some types of rye, especially the very, very early maturing in our dairy systems. And we harvest super early in the dairy systems, and even harvesting super early for most of the forages rye, especially 401, 405 that are very early, they're past the point. So choosing the right variety is good. And the good thing is that both the University of Florida, Auburn University, and also University of Georgia have a very good variety trial testing program that can provide info on the choice of forages to use to maximize
Right.
season long grazing. The second point is the fertilization. A lot of folks are not willing to invest in fertilization in cover crops, but you're basically shooting yourself in the foot if you don't fertilize well, because then we don't have early grazing, we don't have much grazing at all.
Yes, and I think from a biomass production perspective that we have to have fertilization in that system. And that may be a discussion point between if this is two farmers that are having this discussion about management in this system. And perhaps maybe the row crop farmer would not have fertilized that. They would have allowed that mixture to grow and take in whatever nutrients are there in the soil from the prior season. But for the cattle producer, they may need to think about how we can add some fertility to that system to get that production. So I agree with that. And even looking at the rates of fertilization, I think is important and might be something that's different between an ICLS system and if I were overseeding my cool season annuals into my Bahia grass system. So I might utilize a higher rate of nitrogen in that system where I'm overseeding, but maybe I need to have a little bit more middle ground in this cover crop system. So those are some things that differ from the way we typically manage our forages.
Yes, and we talked with Audrey last week, and also with both Dubé before and with Pedro in previous episodes. There is some research pointing to improve nutrient cycling, and actually overall reduction in nutrient needs in input fertilizer needs in integrated systems because of that improved nutrient use efficiency. So basically, both sides are winning when we move. So this is some research from Brazil. When we move the bulk of the fertilization to the pasture crop, we end up having more pasture production, which generates more grazing days, more animals per acre, and also more biomass at the end of the season.
Mm-hmm.
Those nutrients are recycled and are benefiting without detriment, benefiting the next crop. Most of the research has been done with soybeans, so nitrogen was not the big player in the recycling, but I can see the nitrogen also being recycled. That's one of the research questions I have is how can we improve nitrogen use efficiency through those systems? As we move the animals in, there's one main challenge that it's always funny to talk about because you don't want to stand behind the animals whenever you put them in the cool season forages. And we get a lot of calls about that. Can I just start grazing? Oh, my animals are very runny. What should I do?
Right. I would say that sometimes we hear people say that they look empty or they look hollow, when they make that transition onto cool season forages. And that is probably because they were on a higher fiber diet and then they moved into this system that there's a lot of water in those forages and a pretty low fiber concentration in what's growing out there. So one way to kind of help with that is to put hay out in the field where they are grazing on those high quality forages, especially for that first month, just to give them some additional roughage to keep in their rumen. Another strategy is to even look at supplementing sometimes when they're on that pasture system so that we just don't make a stark change from how they were managed before to how they were managed now going out on this cool season forage. It eases the transition for them in terms of their gut health and gives them that more full appearance. But typically it takes, I would say, about a month for them to really adapt to being on that cool season forage and start to fully utilize those nutrients that they can get in that system.
Yeah, and then in terms of performance, we're likely to see a decline in weight, some challenges in the first couple of weeks, then to
Right.
recover fast. and then that's when they move forward in terms of weight gain.
Right.
So that's quite expected.
Yeah. And a unique thing about that is that we see what we call compensatory gain in that transition. So once they have kind of gotten used to being on that system, then they really capitalize on what's out there and will have very high rates of gain, particularly in this time of year, the March, April timeframe.
Perfect. Let's talk about grazing management a little bit, Kim. This is a topic that interests both of us. I see a lot of people too excited to put the animals to graze, and then they result in too early grazing, and that affects season-long productivity. Do you never recover from that?
Yes. So I always have the saying, if it's a haze, don't graze, which just means that we have that feeling where we see that it's green, it's starting to grow, and we're anxious to be able to put those cattle out on that system. But really, we need to ensure that that forage is at its appropriate target height to initiate grazing. And the rule of thumb I was always taught was what you see above ground is what's below ground. So if we start grazing when that forage is too short or not ready to be grazed, then the root system of that forage is not well established. And then we're not going to get that recovery that we need that you described. So the grazing recovery is important from the biomass production standpoint as well, that we can continue to get that growth. We're capitalizing on that vegetative material that's out there and getting that extended grazing window. So grazing height, I think, is a great indicator we can utilize to start grazing. Then once the animals are out on that system, making sure that we're not managing that forage into the ground, basically, that we are trying to have some stubble out there that allows us to get regrowth. And then we have that stubble that will ultimately go into the row crop system later on too.
Yeah, perfect. And when people are thinking you're planning your system and you want to plan for that early forage, the earliest forage as possible, there's two things. One we talked about was the selection of the varieties, the right varieties. Those small grains, oat, triticale, is going to give that early grazing. Rye, some are too early. Some of other varieties are going to be later than what we want, but I think oat and triticale would be on the best spot there. And also early season fertility. Sher Makoviak, another guest here, frequent guest in the Cow Talks podcast, and I often talk about that nitrogen, that early nitrogen and the tillering capacity, to express the tillering capacity in the beginning of the season, and that pretty much determines season-long productivity. So as you mentioned, starting at the right point and not grazing down to the ground, maintaining a grazing height. But then people get very excited towards the end of the season and they want to take the most out of it.
Yes. And that might be a unique aspect of this system too, is that we want to think about leaving some residue, because in order for there to be advantages for both systems, we don't want to take off all of that material and then not have any residue remaining for when we go in to plant those crops. So the residue is important, again, from a nutrient cycling standpoint, also from a moisture retention, as well as even weed control, depending on how much is out there. So we have to kind of think about what's next in the process too, not just the snapshot window of what we're doing right now, but how this affects the system long term. So that's something that's different about this strategy.
Yeah, a lot of the times people are concerned about putting cattle in cropland, especially from the row crop side. And a lot of the times we hear about negative experiences. And I often attribute that negative experience or negative results to proper grazing management, just because we're trying to explore the most out of that. And by taking the most, we're leaving too little for the next phase. We did talk about that grazing management side with Dubé and Pedro before, but I just want to emphasize negative results we've seen in terms of soil compaction, lower animal performance, also because you were exposing those animals to lower quality forage and just limiting intake. And in terms of nutrient cycling, and then crop production has always been associated with high grazing intensity, especially towards the end of the season, to try to take as quote unquote, take the most out of that.
Right. And something that I hear folks talk about that utilize this system is looking at that termination date for grazing. That's an important time to identify. People do it differently. Sometimes when they pull cattle off, they're ready to immediately go in and start planning for the season. But another way to look at it is what if we could have a 2-week window or a 3-week window after we pull those cattle off to still get some additional biomass growth in that system that could then be rolled down into planning for the subsequent season. So it makes an adjustment in terms of the grazing season length. That's a conversation that we have to have, but that's something that we've done in our research at the Wiregrass Extension Center. And we see that in that system, it allows us to get some additional biomass before we go in and plant. So that's something that I think is another way to look at it.
Yep, both ways. You either just don't graze much throughout the season and always have residue, or at minimum take the cattle off of that
right
area. Beaver Yoder, also another guest here in the episode before, had made some comments about this practical management, and one of the things he says is we can start grazing starts with one animal, one calf per acre. So those are lighter animals. And as he buys more calves, he can stock more, increase the stocking rate to the point that he's desired. And also that goes with the increased growth rate towards the middle of the winter and early spring. And then he starts taking those animals off as the growth reduces. But again, to be a good business for both parties, you need to consider those aspects to make sure beef cattle producers are benefiting and also the row crop is
Absolutely
getting the best out of it. Another thing that Beaver mentioned, which was very interesting, and I think several of the row crop people agreed with him during the symposium there, he said that the main benefit for the row crop person is not the cash obtained from the grazing days, but improvement in soil quality and the improvement in crop production that follows this integration.
That's right. Yes. And that's really what we hope to see out of that, is that we're managing both in a way to where we get a great productive year-round system.
Perfect. Kim, any other aspect that we have not covered in this conversation?
No, I really don't think so. I think we've kind of hit the high points of discussing cool season forages and their quality aspects, biomass production, but thinking about how specifically they integrate into that row crop system picture, and not just always thinking about it separately as we might if we were traditionally talking about forages for beef cattle.
Perfect. And so just for our listeners, in terms of perspective, we have a series of episodes in integration of crop and livestock systems, covering from the big perspective into the crop, to the soils, and now through the cattle production system. There are more resources in our websites. One of those is the Southeastern Grazing Exchange, for those that are interested in connecting with producers across the Southeast that are offering either grazing land or grazing animals that are needing more land. That's a good way to network. That is a project also sponsored by the Florida Department of Ag, hosted in our university, but available for the whole Southeast. We're trying to expand that network and add to the resources that we provide. If you have more questions about integration of crop livestock systems, first contact us and contact your local extension agent. In Alabama, that can be done through the
Alabama Cooperative Extension website, aces.edu.
Perfect, aces.edu. And in Florida, we have our directory, but you can also reach out to us directly through forages at heifers.ufl.edu. Those links are going to be in the description of those podcasts. Kim, thanks a lot for joining the Cow Talks podcast today, and I am looking forward for our next conversation. We need to come up with another topic and schedule our next meeting. It's always great to talk to you, listen to you, and pick your brain and hear about your experience.
This is great, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on and get to visit with you.
Thanks a lot. Cow Talk Podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the University of Florida College of Agriculture and Life Sciences Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Wallau, Olivia Maule, and Ashley Kanabrowski.